Hi class, this is the first part of the lecture on Chapter 1, Fundamentals of Communication Sciences and Disorders. Um, we are launching into a discussion about a career in communication. Communication is a function that's fundamental to our identification as human. If you've looked on Titanium, you saw that I put a quote up at the announcement at the top of the page by Professor Tim Huelhoff, Dr. Tim Huelhoff. He is a professor at Biola University in the communication department, and this is the quote. Communication exists on two levels, the content level and the relational level. The content level consists of the words we use to convey a message, while the relational level involves the amount of acknowledgement and respect between two individuals. The reason I chose to put this quote at the top of our class is because we have to consider communication on both of those planes. For the majority of our discussion of communication sciences and disorders, we're looking at that content level, the words we use, how we order them, how we say them, how we interpret situations and choose words to use. But we also always have to be mindful of that relational level. We communicate for a reason, we communicate for relationship. And so it's important that we always keep that in mind. The significance of communication cannot be overstated in the notion of healthy and satisfying existence. Communication disorders are relatively common and occur to some degree or at some point in the lifespan in 1 of every 6 persons. According to the online Merriam-Webster dictionary, communication is a process by which information is exchanged between individuals through a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior. We're going to come back to some of those pieces. From our textbook, communication is the transmission of thoughts or feelings from the mind of the speaker to the mind of the listener. So there are always two main players, right? A sender or speaker and receiver. Therein lies a bit of a problem. Communication is not always spoken. We communicate through a number of different means, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There are 4 processes involved in this communication. The first is formulation, the pulling together of one's thoughts in order to get them ready to share. This is a silent cognitive process, formulation. The second is transmission, conveying those thoughts to another person by some means. Most commonly, it is spoken, but I'm sure you can think of, and if we were sitting in class together, I would ask you to raise hands and tell me those some of those other means. We communicate by sign language. We can communicate in writing. We communicate by text. We communicate by body language. There are many ways that we are transmitting those thoughts. So 4 processes: formulation, transmission. The next is reception. This is the process of receiving that information, both by means of hearing it and visually. And then the 4th is comprehension. So now another silent cognitive process, making sense of the message we've received. Speaking is not obviously the only modality for effective communication, but it is the means most commonly and broadly used. It is always typically the most efficient. And we'll talk about that in another chapter. For example, when we get to the chapter on augmentative communication, why we would choose to use augmentative or alternative means of communication when speech really is most efficient. In order for communication to be effective, there must be a sender, a receiver, and a shared modality. That modality, again, speech, sign language, a shared language. An additional component of this model is feedback. Feedback, it can take on a number of different forms. Linguistic feedback relies on words. It's like saying things like, I don't understand you, or, oh, I get it. Or it could be vocalizations like, or uh-oh. Those are feedback. They're telling us that we've understood, that the conversation can move along. Non-linguistic feedback is the use of things like eye contact, facial expression, posture. For example, a teacher in a classroom knows that students are not understanding the lecture by looking at facial expression and body language. A comedian knows that his jokes have bombed by non linguistic feedback. An airport screener often knows that a specific passenger's behavior is atypical, and he knows that or she knows that by looking at things like body language and eye contact. So that's non linguistic feedback. Paralinguistic feedback refers to those vocal features or use of your voice that are superimposed over the words you're saying. So, for example, I can take the same phrase, the phrase, I get it, and I can make it mean slightly different things. I can say, oh, I get it, or I get it, or I get it. I superimposed vocal features, my voice, over the same words and changed the meaning slightly. We use feedback to prevent communication breakdowns, or in the event of, like, say, the airport screener, to understand why the person they are observing is unintentionally, or what the person they are observing is unintentionally communicating. In email or on Facebook posts or in texts, how do we try to control for communication breakdowns in these modalities? We can apply vocal features. How do we do that? Well, we do it with emojis, right? We send a message and we look, or we type a message and we look at it and we go, I'm not sure they're going to understand that I'm happy about that. So we put a smiley face. Or I'm not sure they're going to understand this makes me angry. So we put the angry face. We use emojis to control for that same communication breakdown. Communication has a purpose. Its purpose is to provide or solicit information. Halliday, back in 1975, identified 7 categories of communicative purpose. The first of these is instrumental communication. This is requesting, the ability to request. Can I have a glass of water? May I have more? The second is regulatory communication. This is giving direction to the listener or listeners, or attempts to control the behavior of another person. So please take out the trash. Can you turn out the lights on your way out? Interactional communication is communication used for social or conversational interaction. It's the give and take of conversation and the language that is involved in being able to signal that. So asking the person, what did you think when that happened? Something that extends the conversation. The fourth function is personal communication. This is expression of state of mind or feelings about something. So things like, I'm so happy for you, or this is delicious. The fifth function is heuristic communication. Heuristic communication is what we use to make inquiry, to explore, to gain knowledge. So, do you know when this is going to happen? Or tell me why. Tell me more about that. The sixth function is imaginative communication. This is the communication involved in telling stories or role play or pretending. And the seventh is informative communication. This is being able to provide an organized description of an object or an event. So telling the details of a birthday party, retelling a story that you've read, or a movie that you've watched. A communication disorder is present when there's a substantial impairment in a person's ability to communicate, and typically a restricted range of communicative functions is one of the first signs of a communicative disorder. That breakdown in communication can be either receptive or expressive. Those are terms I need to define for you. Receptive is what we're understanding about what we're hearing, and expressive is how we're using language to express ourselves. A child or an adult with a significant disorder of speech sound production may have difficulty across all of these functions because of their limited ability to make themselves understood. A child with a language disorder often has difficulty formulating questions, significantly limiting their ability to interact both conversationally or to make inquiries in the classroom. A person with autism spectrum disorder may exhibit some level of disorder across all of these functions, but specifically, they will have difficulty with personal communication, imaginative communication, and heuristic communication. A stroke patient may lose the ability to formulate requests or express feelings. A stutterer may have great difficulty making requests because they struggle to get those words out, and on and on. We've all experienced instances of communicative breakdown, even without having or being with someone with a communication disorder. Also in 1975, Grice described 4 principles of effective communication, the 4 things that are needed at the most basic level for communication to be effective. The first thing is quantity, providing the right amount and type of information needed for the speaker to fully comprehend your message. So this might be demonstrated, or a deficit in this might be demonstrated for the person who brings you in the middle of their thought process. So we have something organized for May, and it will, and okay, but first you need to tell me what you have organized for May. Or, oh, I forgot to tell you, he said he would come later today. Okay, I don't have the right quantity of information. Who is he? The second principle is quality of information. Is the information being shared accurate? And is it specific enough for me to understand? A term that I use with my young students is the term junk words. Junk words are words such as things and stuff. So if I ask my students when we get back from winter break, what did you do over winter break? And they say, I did all kinds of stuff. Still don't have any idea what they did. Or, did you get Christmas presents? What did you get from Santa? And they say all kinds of things. It's junk words. I still don't have the right quality of information from them. Kids will often tell me, if I ask them what their moms or dads do for their job, they'll say they're a worker. Again, it's kind of a junk word. It's not a quality of information. I'm a worker. Probably most of you are too. The third principle of effective communication is relevance. Maintenance of topic and appropriate transitions between topics. Is what you are saying relevant to the topic at hand? Autistic persons tend to limit topics or have inappropriate transitions. So they may be in a group of friends talking about the basketball game last night, and all of a sudden they want to talk about the train that they saw day before yesterday. Not relevant to the topic at hand. And then the fourth principle is manner. Manner is being able to speak fluently without frequent hesitations or revisions, taking appropriate turns, appropriate loudness, appropriate cultural gestures. So it's more looking at that, the mechanics of our speech and the appropriateness to the situation. All of these functions and principles break down in normal, average communicators. But in those with communication disorders, the breakdown is significant and persistent. The key processes of human communication, these are in your textbook on page 10, represented in figure 1.2. These key processes of human communication: language formation, the cognitive process by which we're formulating our ideas and thoughts; transmission of those thoughts or ideas via speech. We're going to talk about speech, even though we know we can transmit those ideas in other ways. Speech, by the way, is a neuromuscular process. Neuromuscular process, that's an important term. Please remember that term. A neuromuscular process by which we turn that language into a sound signal to be transmitted to a receiver. Speech involves using our voice and articulation. The process of transmission, though, can also be writing, texting, signing. Other species communicate, but only humans have speech and language. So we had language formation, transmission. The next is reception or hearing. of that shared thought or idea, pretty self-explanatory. And then the fourth is comprehension. Again, this involves language to interpret what we've heard or what we've read, to interpret the communication. So we're going to break language down, break down all language, speech, and hearing into smaller parts, into their definitions. According to Nelson in 1998, language is a, quote, socially shared code that uses a conventional system of arbitrary symbols to represent ideas about the world that are meaningful to others who know the same code. Perfectly clear, right? Okay, let's break it down. Socially shared, a community of speakers that share the same system for communicating their thoughts and ideas. This can be spoken language. We can speak English, French, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese. We have a socially shared system for communicating. We can communicate via American Sign Language as long as we're communicating with another group or another individual who has this shared system of communication. So language is socially shared. Language is a code. It's a shared set of symbols that represent thoughts. In other words, words. So I don't share the Japanese language. So if I were traveling in Japan, I cannot communicate with the code of spoken language. I would have to resort to gestures, pointing, trying to figure out pictures because I don't share the spoken code. Language is a socially shared code that uses a conventional system. Conventional means that the code is rule governed. Each code, in our case English, has rules for what sounds can be combined and how words can be strung together to make sentences. That code is representational. Language is a representational tool that allows us to share our thoughts and our ideas. It allows our brain to store information and carry out higher thinking processes like reasoning and hypothesizing and planning. So back to our definition. It's a socially shared code that uses a conventional system of arbitrary symbols to represent ideas about the world that are meaningful to others who know the same code. Some of the remarkable features of language, of any language, remarkable in that these are really pretty extraordinary. The first is universality. Every human culture has one or more languages, and they are all complex. This is a universal feature of being human. We have language. It is species specific. No other species can communicate the way humans do. Other species do communicate, but it's limited and it's transparent. So the book uses the term iconic, and that's okay. You think of an icon on your computer. It means one thing and one thing only. Every time you see it, you know exactly what it intends to communicate. That W on your computer is for word. A very simplistic example how human communication is anything but iconic is our proclivity for using words to mean more than one thing. So, for example, the word run has dozens of meanings. You can run for office. Your nose can run. You can get a run in your stockings. You can run down the street on your feet or run to the store in the car. The faucet can run. You can run up a bill. You can run out of gas. So if we just look at the word run, we're not going to come up with the correct meaning until we have context. The word run is not iconic. Another remarkable feature of language is that it has semanticity. Human language can represent events in the past, in the present, and in the future. It can represent events or ideas that are intangible or hypothetical. It's not confined to the concrete and to the here and the now. We use very specific words to relate changes in time. In other words, verb tensing. We describe events or things with very specific vocabulary related to their being real or to their being hypothetical. So it has semanticity. It also has productivity. Language is able to combine small, discrete units into infinite novel creations. There are rules governing the combinations of sounds or words within each language, but even within those constraints, the combinations are seemingly endless. Even a toddler with just 50 words can combine them and rearrange them into hundreds of sentences. The example in the book, it talks about a species that cannot utilize this principle, and the species is the night monkey. They have 16 different identified units of communication. They have, each of those 16 has a very discrete meaning. They can only communicate 16 different things. They cannot combine them into novel structures to mean something else. I can almost guarantee that on any given day, each one of you says a sentence you have never said before. You combine words in novel ways, and the person you're saying it to understands it. We have productivity in our language. Another amazing feature is the rate of acquisition of language. Language and speech development is pretty miraculous. All babies' brains are wired to learn any language on earth. And children around the world follow the same sequence of early language development. By the time a child starts to imitate the sounds of his parents' language, which is around 6 months, he begins the process of discarding the neurological pathways that would be needed to learn the sounds represented in another language that are not in his language. We know from studies of newborns that they prefer to hear speech over other sounds. The rate of acquisition of language is astounding. By the age of 5, language development is fairly complete. That doesn't mean that we won't continue to acquire new vocabulary or more complex language structure, but what it means is that in a normally developing child who's neurologically intact, language has developed by the age of 5 that allows that child to use language for any of those functions we mentioned in Halliday's function, any function for age-appropriate purpose. So conversation with peers, conversation with adults, education, pretend play. All of those things are pretty much intact by age 5. The language domains. The standard means of explaining language in the field is by the 3 domains described by Bloom and Leahy. These 3 language domains, when integrated, reflect the whole that is language. This is in figure 1.3, page 14 in your textbook, and my description of it is going to be maybe slightly different from your textbook, so please be aware of that. These 3 language domains, if we get through this semester and by the end of the semester you don't know these 3 language domains and what they consist of, then I haven't done my job. This is of great importance, so please pay attention here and take some good notes. The first domain is content. Content is the part of language that directly involves meaning. So if I were to make a chart like you have in your book, we would have content, and under that is vocabulary and semantics. Because language is used to communicate, it must be about something, and that something is its content. It's the meaning, the semantics. Semantic features are pieces of meaning that come together to define a particular word. For example, the words girl and woman, they share the semantic feature of feminine and human. But the notion of child, the semantic feature of child, is generally reserved considered a feature of girl, but not of woman. It's these shades of meaning that determine how we select a word or phrase to use to best communicate our meaning. So choosing the word big versus the word humongous. It's those parts of language like synonyms and antonyms, words of multiple meaning, idioms. It's how we categorize words, how we make comparisons between words. All of this is tied up in meaning or in content. So, for example, I'm a fan of giving you illustrations from movies, so bear with me. The movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, one of my favorites. If you haven't seen it, it's okay. Her last name, the young woman's name in this movie is Portokalos. And there's a scene where her future in-laws ask her, does that word have meaning in your language? And she said, well, it means orange. But then she realizes she has to tell them, like the one you peel, not the color. These are content explanations, okay? She's explaining the relationship between the words, the word of multiple meaning in English, orange. She's providing content. The next domain of language is form, the second domain. Form is the structures of language, how sounds, words, and sentences are organized in order to best and most accurately convey the content. So if we look at the structures under form, we're going to see syntax, morphology, and phonology. Syntax is spoken grammar. It's word order within a sentence. In English, for example, in a declarative sentence, the subject comes before the verb. John is going to the opera. When we reverse the order of the subject and the auxiliary or helping verb, we change the meaning of the sentence and we end up with a question. Is John going to the opera? While we probably can't repeat all of the rules for syntactic structure, our linguistic intuition makes it easier for us to understand the meaning triggered by changes in structure. The next component under form is morphology. Morphology is the internal organization within a single word to represent meaning. A morpheme is the smallest grammatical unit within a language. Words can contain both free morphemes and bound morphemes. So a free morpheme may stand alone as a word. For example, cat, go, like, magnificent, walk. These are all free morphemes. They're standalone words. If you attempt to break them into smaller units, you lose the meaning of the word. Even that longer word, magnificent, we can't break it apart and find meaning in each of those parts. But these bound morphemes then cannot stand alone. They have to be tied to a free morpheme. So they are things like s at the end of a word, ing, ing at the end of a word, ly at the end of a word, ed at the end of a word. These are morphemes. They have meaning, but they can't stand alone. So now that same list of words, a free morpheme with a bound morpheme, cats, going, magnificently, and walked, all contain one free and one bound morpheme. This is morphology. Phonology is the sound system of a language and the rules about how we combine sounds into words. English uses about 40 to 43 sounds or phonemes, depending on the dialect. And we have rules governing their possible combination. So, for example, g, the sound g, never follows s at the beginning of a word. Other languages have easier phonology than English. For example, Spanish, the phonology is pretty simple. Letters almost always represent the same sound, whereas in English we fool with that a whole lot. Our phonology is very complex. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about all of these pieces of form and how they interact with content. So, does the word form, walk to say walking, does that impact meaning? Well, yes, of course it does. But we said that meaning was part of content and not form. Walking versus strolling versus ambling, that's content, that's semantics. They're synonyms, correct? A change in form can change meaning, but not in the same way. Walk to walking changes meaning because it reflects a change in time or tensing. The third domain is use. So content, form, and use. Use is how language is used functionally to get personal and social needs met. Under the heading use, we're going to have pragmatics and social language. And this is where I think it may differ from the chart in your text. It adds one piece to this. Pragmatics, this is the driving force behind all aspects of language. We speak for a reason. It's the purpose behind our utterances, the rules and guidelines governing how language is used for social purposes. Conversation, different language for different purpose or different listeners, the social conventions. Pragmatic language includes not only the words and sentences we use, but also the non-linguistic aspects of communication, such as turn-taking and posture, pitch, loudness. So, for example, if you're with a friend and you're hungry, you might say, "Let's go get something to eat." If function was a simple biological drive, then eat might suffice. But who and where you are and the time of day also influences what you say. So if you're at your home and you've invited this friend to dinner, you might say, "Dinner's ready." If you're working with someone and it's about noon, you might say, "Hey, let's break for lunch." If you're on a date and you're not sure that a meal is involved with this date, but you're really hungry, you might inquire, "Hey, are you hungry?" Some of these rules, back up a minute, so you can see how pragmatics comes into play. We need to look for the social conventions. We change the way we ask basically the same question based on who we're with, time of day, place. Some of the rules for speakers of American English include things like only one person speaks at a time, and each person should contribute to a conversation. A second rule might be speakers shouldn't be interrupted. A third might be each utterance should be relevant. We should stay on topic. And the fourth is politeness forms that reflect the relationship of the communicative partners. These are all fall under pragmatics and social language. Okay, I'm going to explain a term now that's not in your text. I believe it's in the PowerPoints, so please take notes on this. If I'm providing it, it's a term that I want you to know. I'm sorry that the text doesn't include it. It did in the previous edition. It's the term metalinguistic awareness. Metalinguistic awareness. What it means is making language the object of attention. Using language to think about and analyze language. Each of the domains of language, content, form, and use can be the object of metalinguistic scrutiny. So some examples. Content or semantic awareness is needed to analyze words or concepts explicitly. So I love this example. Here's an example, so hang on with me here. If I ask, what does shipwreck mean? Okay, the word shipwreck becomes the object of scrutiny. If I ask, what is that cat doing? Let's pretend that you're in a room with a cat and we can all see the cat. Cat is the object of scrutiny. The second inquiry about the cat is an easier task because it's contextual. We can see the cat. We don't have to draw on terribly deep cognitive resources to respond in some specific way. The first inquiry, what does shipwreck mean, is much more complex because it's decontextualized. We don't have a shipwreck in our sights. We may never have seen a shipwreck. We have to depend on our cognitive ability to retrieve that word from our mental dictionary and consider its meaning or discuss its meaning. This is even more difficult if we don't know its explicit meaning, but perhaps we have to infer it from the two-word part of the compound. We know what ship is, we know what the word wreck means, so we can make an inference about what the word means. Syntactic awareness, so again, metalinguistic awareness, now looking at syntax. Syntactic awareness is needed to analyze sentence grammar explicitly. Looking at or listening to a sentence and answering the question, what is wrong with this grammar? For example, if I said, her did it, can you look at that and figure out what's wrong? Phonological awareness. Now using metalinguistic awareness to analyze phonology. This involves analyzing the sound structure of a language. So if I ask you, what is the first sound you hear in the word bottle? Bottle. By the way, the first sound is not B. B is a grapheme, it's not a phoneme. The first sound is B. Okay. And then pragmatic awareness or metalinguistic awareness around use or pragmatics. Metalinguistic awareness involves analyzing language use in social situations. So thinking about, how could I say that more politely? Or why don't we talk loudly in libraries? These are all part of metalinguistic scrutiny or metalinguistic awareness. Okay, I'm going to stop this video for now. I think that one was pretty long. And we will move on to the next part of chapter 1 in the next video.